What happened before creation according to the Bible? Who existed before everything? According to the Bible, there are actually some passages that tell us a few very intriguing details. And here's a surprise. They're not from the Bible's creation stories in Genesis. So what are they and what do they say? Let's look at a few passages to find out. This channel is a safe place for you to explore God, whether you have faith or you're just curious. The first passage is in Proverbs 8, verse 22. The passage begins to hint at something kind of surprising. Let's see if you can catch it. The Lord brought me forth as the first of his works before his deeds of old. I was formed long ages ago at the very beginning when the world came to be. When there were no watery depths, I was given birth. When there were no springs overflowing with water. Before the mountains were settled in place, before the hills, I was given birth. Before he made the world or its fields or any of the dust of the earth. I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep. Did you notice anything odd? The passage describes someone watching God plan and create the universe, but it's not referring to Jesus here. So, who is it? The first two verses of Proverbs 8 give us a hint. Proverbs 8:1-2 say this, "Does not wisdom call out? Does not understanding raise her voice? At the highest point along the way, where the paths meet, she takes her stand." It's a she, a woman. Not literally, though. This is poetic language, wisdom personified. So before you feel like I tricked you, there is actually someone else watching God create the universe. Or should I say, someone's. And it's not metaphoric language. I'll show you that in the next passage. But here, our takeaway from this passage. Divine wisdom is personified as a woman who existed before the world was made. A way of saying that wisdom existed before the universe. But who else was really there, watching the creation of the universe? Sometimes when I introduce this next passage to people, even people who have read the Bible for years, they're very surprised at what it has to say. So let me see if you can spot why this is a favorite passage of mine from Job 38:4-7. Here God is speaking to Job, and he says this, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set, or who laid its cornerstone, while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy?" We learned something really intriguing here. The angels already existed before God created the world and humans. They watched him decide how big the world would be when he created it. Sometimes when people discover the angels existed before humans, their eyes bug out of their heads. But if you think about it, the Bible never really says when angels were created, just that they were created before us. So is that news to you? This will help explain a major storyline in the Bible. A big part of the Bible's storyline involves other spiritual beings like Satan harassing and meddling with humans. And you're wondering, why is this happening? Well, we've just learned that we are actually the younger sibling of the angels. And if you've ever had kids or a brother or sister, then you've probably experienced firsthand how the older child often deals with insecurity or jealousy, which could explain a lot about why beings like Satan are tempting humans and messing with them throughout the rest of the Bible. It's just basic family dynamics, only across species. They probably got jealous because we invented beer and video games, and they're stuck just flying around playing harps. Actually, I bet their lives were a lot more interesting than we realize. But moving on, there are two more verses left on our list to investigate that are quite stunning. One that will elaborate on the angels and their hierarchy. But first, a certain verse that reveals someone else who was there when God created the world. And this person was directly involved in its creation. It's from the famous passage John 1. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And get a load of this. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. Okay, so God is being called the Word here. Skip down to verse 14 and we'll find out more. "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who comes from the Father." Maybe you've heard this before, but have you ever really spent some time thinking about what this really says? The longer you read this passage, the more obvious it becomes that the subject of this chapter is Jesus. If you couldn't tell by saying the Word became flesh, John is saying God became human. Then he says we've seen him, the Son of God, referring to Jesus. Sometimes people get that phrase, Son of God, confused, and for good reason. Some say, well, Jesus isn't God, he's just the Son of God. Well, that title, Son of God, meant something a little different in their culture than what it sounds like it should mean. If you read that passage closely, you can see that John is saying God himself became human. And that is who we call the Son of God. There's overlap between the two. They are separate beings, but they're also the same being. So it's kind of not a human concept. So what exactly is John saying when he says, in the beginning was the Word? If the Word is God, and the Word is also Jesus, and Jesus said he existed before he was born in some other places, well then this verse is saying that Jesus was there at the creation of the universe. He just hadn't been born as a flesh and blood human yet. Now, John often gets accused of just making this up, adding new wild ideas to the Bible, and even some scholars think that. So it's not surprising that I meet a lot of people who think John made this up too. And some of the skepticism seems to stem from John being the last person to write books of the Bible, about 20 years after everybody else. And some people struggle to clearly find earlier verses in the Bible that describe Jesus as God, or Jesus present during the creation of the world. But there's something they don't know, though. John's ideas are not new. He's actually just rephrasing ideas from earlier places in the Bible, which leads to our final passage to investigate. While Jesus himself made several statements implying that he existed hundreds of years before he was born, there is actually at least one other writer who mentions Jesus' role in the creation of the universe. It's Paul in Colossians 1:15-16. This verse is hiding something spectacular involving the creation of angels and their role in our world. Prepare to have your mind blown. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. There's one takeaway here that's fairly obvious and another that is not. Here, Paul mentions Jesus' role in the creation of the universe, that the universe was created through Jesus. Elsewhere in Acts 17, Paul talks about the God who created the world and everything in it. But here we see that to Paul, that God who created everything is Jesus, just like what John said. Now we know that John didn't just make up this idea, but other biblical writers shared it too. But the hidden layer of this passage is what's most fascinating. It seems strange at first that Jesus created things in heaven and on earth, thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. In English, it reads like these powers and authorities are just human kings or rulers, but in English, the translation is somewhat obscured. So what happens when we look at the original Greek language? What do we find? So remember the verse said by Jesus, thrones or dominions were created. Well, there's nothing real strange about the Greek word for thrones. But the Greek word used for dominions has a secret. The Luneta Greek-English lexicon says, in general, the series of terms in Colossians 1:16 are understood as being cosmic powers, whether angelic or demonic, but it is possible that these terms should be understood in terms of human rulers. I would argue that that last part, based on the context, is actually incorrect. It may include human rulers, but some of these terms are exclusively supernatural. This verse itself actually stated that we're talking about heavenly rulers. But when I look at the other Greek terms in this verse, the word used for rulers, for example, in the same Greek to English lexicon, says this: titles for supernatural forces and powers, a supernatural power having some particular role in controlling the destiny and activities of human beings, powers, authority, lordship, ruler, wicked force. So this verse, that word rulers, means angels who influence humans for good or for bad. So Colossians 1:16 actually says Jesus created the angels. They were created by him, for him. Now, you don't actually need to look up all that Greek stuff to figure out that the rulers and authorities Jesus created here were angels. Paul actually repeats this phrase about rulers, powers, and authorities in Ephesians 6:12, but he clarifies a little more there. It says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. That verse uses the same words for rulers and authorities, but this time it clarifies that they're not human. They're spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. In other words, they're in the spiritual realm, not here on earth. This verse suggests that some angels are on thrones over human dominions and territories. And Paul didn't just make that up. The idea comes from Deuteronomy 32, but that is for another day on this channel, so hit subscribe. So what are we supposed to take away from all this? If we boil these passages about what happened before creation down to one consistent teaching, we get this. The source of wisdom is God, but God is Jesus, so the source of wisdom is also Jesus. And God, who is also Jesus, created the angels. Then the angels watched as God, who is also Jesus, created the universe. And this last part is a bonus because it took place after creation. God set some of the angels on thrones to rule and watch over territories of humans. We don't have a lot of detail about what happened in the spiritual realm before the universe was made, but we found out a few things. Now we know God had an audience when he created it, and some of them have jobs that may affect us now. If you thought this was interesting, get a load of this. According to multiple Old Testament passages, God may have appeared on the earth in the form of a man before he was ever born as the man Jesus, and quite a few familiar biblical characters actually met him in person when he took the form of a man.